At exactly 8:47 p.m., on a rain-soaked street outside Columbus, Ohio, a black Cadillac Escalade rolled slowly past a row of collapsing homes and stopped in front of the smallest house on the block. Within seconds, porch lights flickered on one after another. Curtains shifted. Neighbors stepped outside without saying a word, because people in that neighborhood had never seen a vehicle like that stop there before. And they definitely had never seen two men in tailored suits step out holding leather folders with Clara Stark's name printed across the front. One of the men walked carefully through the rain, stopped at Clara's front door, and knocked twice. Inside the house, Clara froze. Her hands were still wet from washing dishes in a rusted kitchen sink when she heard the second knock. She glanced toward the window, confused, then slowly opened the door just enough to see the stranger standing there beneath the porch light. The man looked at her for a moment before asking a question that made her heartbeat change instantly. "Are you Clara Stark?" She nodded carefully. The man lowered his voice. "Ma'am, we've been searching for you for weeks." At that exact moment, every neighbor watching from outside thought the same thing. Clara had somehow gotten herself into trouble. Maybe debt collectors, maybe police, maybe something worse. But nobody standing there could have imagined the truth. Because 8 months earlier, Clara Stark was just another exhausted waitress working double shifts at a roadside diner off Interstate 71, trying to survive after losing almost everything she had. And every single night, just before closing, she would quietly pack leftovers into a small paper bag and hand them to an old homeless man sitting behind the restaurant near the dumpsters. Most customers barely looked at him. Some complained when he came too close to the entrance. Others acted like he didn't exist at all. But Clara always stopped, even on nights when her own refrigerator at home was nearly empty. What she never knew was that the old man watching her from beneath that torn gray coat was not homeless. His real name was Arthur Calloway, and for more than 40 years, Arthur had built one of the largest privately owned manufacturing companies in America. His factories stretched across Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Indiana. His name appeared in business magazines. Politicians called him personally. Wall Street analysts tracked his every move. But nearly a year before this night, Arthur vanished from public life without warning. No interviews, no board meetings, no explanation. Even his own executives believed he was losing his mind. But Arthur Calloway hadn't disappeared because he was confused. He disappeared because he was searching for something his fortune could not buy, something he believed no one around him still possessed. And somehow, against all odds, he believed he had finally found it in a tired waitress living in one of the poorest neighborhoods in Ohio. What Clara didn't know was that every meal she handed him, every conversation, every small act of kindness had been quietly documented for months. And the men standing at her door that night had not arrived to thank her. They had arrived to change her life forever. Before we go further, let us know where you're watching from in the comments. And don't forget to hit the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To everyone passing through Miller's Diner off Interstate 71, Arthur Calloway looked like a man the world had already forgotten. His coat was stained from weeks of rain. The soles of his shoes were splitting apart. His hands trembled whenever winter winds pushed through the alley behind the restaurant. Most customers avoided eye contact completely. Some asked the manager to make him leave before they finished eating. Others stared at him with the same uncomfortable expression people often wear when they are forced to look at suffering they would rather ignore. But Clara Stark noticed something nobody else did. The old man never begged, never complained, and no matter how cold the weather became, he always spoke carefully, almost formally, like someone who had spent his life inside boardrooms instead of shelters. Even the way he folded napkins seemed strangely precise. One night, Clara caught a glimpse of an expensive silver watch beneath his sleeve before he quickly covered it again. Another evening, she watched him reading the financial section of a newspaper someone had left behind at the counter. Not casually, closely, like the numbers actually mattered to him. At first, Clara assumed he had once been successful and simply lost everything. But the truth was far more complicated than that. Arthur Calloway was worth nearly $3 billion. For over 4 decades, he had quietly built Calloway Industrial Systems into one of the largest manufacturing companies in the Midwest. His factories employed thousands of workers across 5 states. Entire towns depended on his business to survive. Governors invited him to private events. News anchors described him as one of the last old-school American industrialists. But 6 months before Clara first met him, Arthur vanished from public life without warning. One morning, his office chair sat empty. His assistants received no instructions. Board meetings were canceled indefinitely. And within days, financial reporters across the country began asking the same question. Where was Arthur Calloway? Behind closed doors, panic spread quickly through the company. Senior executives argued constantly. Investors feared the company was collapsing. Arthur's nephew, Daniel Calloway, immediately pushed for temporary control of the business, claiming his uncle was no longer mentally fit to lead. But several members of the board refused to hand him that power. They knew Arthur too well. Men like Arthur Calloway did not simply disappear without a reason. What nobody realized was that Arthur had spent years quietly watching the people around him become consumed by greed. Family members who only called when they needed money. Executives willing to destroy loyal employees to protect profits. People who smiled in public while secretly fighting for his fortune behind his back. The older Arthur became, the more one terrifying thought followed him everywhere. If he died tomorrow, everything he built would end up in the wrong hands. So he made a decision almost nobody would have believed. He disappeared on purpose, not to hide from the world, but to study it. For months, Arthur traveled quietly through small towns across Ohio, pretending to be homeless, watching how strangers behaved when they believed nobody important was looking. Most ignored him. Some insulted him openly. A few offered spare change without even slowing down. But none of them made Arthur reconsider what he believed about people anymore. Until he met Clara Stark. Every meal she handed him was quietly recorded in handwritten notes by Arthur's legal team. Every conversation was documented. Every act of patience, every moment of honesty, every decision she made while believing she had nothing to gain was carefully observed from a distance. Clara thought she was helping a lonely old man survive another winter. She had no idea some of the most powerful attorneys in Ohio already knew her name. And without realizing it, she was slowly becoming the center of a decision worth billions of dollars. But everything changed one freezing Thursday night, when Clara made a choice that nearly destroyed Arthur's entire plan. 3 years before the black SUV arrived outside her home, Clara Stark had been living a completely different life. Back then, she still believed hard work protected people from disaster. Her husband, Michael Stark, worked as an electrician just outside Columbus, and together they had spent nearly 15 years building the kind of ordinary life most people never stop to appreciate until it disappears. Weekend grocery trips. Football games on television, quiet dinners at the kitchen table, a small backyard where their son, Ethan, used to practice baseball until sunset. Then Michael was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer. Everything changed within months. The treatments were aggressive. The hospital visits became constant. Clara picked up extra shifts wherever she could while Michael grew weaker with every passing season. At first they used their savings, then retirement accounts, then credit cards. By the second year, the bills arriving in the mailbox were larger than their mortgage payments had ever been. Collection agencies started calling during dinner. Clara stopped answering unknown numbers entirely. Michael died on a cold November morning just 2 weeks before Thanksgiving. And after the funeral ended and everyone slowly returned to their own lives, Clara found herself standing alone in a hospital parking lot, realizing she still owed hundreds of thousands of dollars she could never realistically repay. The savings disappeared first, then the truck, then the family home they had spent years restoring together. By the age of 42, Clara was renting a small weather-damaged house on the edge of town while working double shifts at Miller's Diner 6 days a week, trying to keep herself and Ethan afloat. Most mornings started before sunrise. Cheap coffee, cold floors, quiet exhaustion. She learned how to stretch leftovers across several days. Learned how to smile at customers even when her feet ached so badly she could barely stand by the end of the night. But the hardest part was Ethan. At 16, he had already started noticing the things Clara tried desperately to hide. The overdue notices folded beneath kitchen drawers, the leaking roof above the hallway, the empty refrigerator near the end of every month. Sometimes Clara would wake up in the middle of the night and find Ethan pretending to sleep on the couch because rainwater had started dripping through the ceiling onto his bed again. Yet somehow, despite everything, Clara never became bitter. People at the diner noticed it constantly. She never argued, never insulted difficult customers, Never complained when coworkers called in sick and forced her to stay late. And every night around closing time, after the final customers left and the neon signs outside began flickering against the dark highway, the same quiet ritual always repeated itself. Arthur Calloway would appear behind the diner near the alley. Sometimes he sat on an overturned milk crate beside the dumpsters. Other nights, he simply stood there silently beneath the broken security light while traffic rushed past the interstate in the distance. Clara would pack leftover food into a paper bag, glance around carefully to make sure the manager wasn't watching, then carry it outside to him. Arthur never asked for anything, never begged, never tried to make her feel sorry for him. He would simply accept the food with both hands and look directly at her before saying the exact same words every single night. "Thank you for seeing me." At first, Clara thought it was just an unusual expression. But over time, those words started staying with her long after she returned home. Because there was something deeply sincere in the way Arthur said them. Like most people had spent years looking straight through him. And slowly, Clara began noticing things about him that didn't make sense. His vocabulary was too polished for someone supposedly living on the streets. He spoke about economics, history, and manufacturing like a man who had spent decades inside executive meetings. One evening while handing him coffee, Clara noticed scars running across his hands that looked more surgical than accidental. Another night, she caught sight of an expensive silver watch hidden beneath his sleeve before he pulled it away almost immediately. Then there were the cars. At least twice a week, Clara noticed dark vehicles parked across the street near closing time. The engines stayed running. The windows remained tinted. And whenever Arthur left the alley, the vehicles quietly disappeared minutes later. Clara considered asking him about it several times, but something always stopped her. Maybe it was the strange sadness in his eyes. Or maybe it was the feeling that Arthur carried a story far heavier than the one everyone else assumed. Then one freezing Thursday night in January, Clara stepped outside with his usual paper bag of food and saw something that made her stop walking entirely. Across the street, beneath a flickering street lamp, a black Cadillac Escalade sat motionless with two men inside watching them both. The next evening began like every other Friday at Miller's Diner. Every booth was full before sunset. Truck drivers crowded the counter. Families filled the back tables. Waitresses moved quickly between coffee pots and plates while country music crackled softly through old ceiling speakers. Clara had already been on her feet for nearly 11 hours when the front door opened and cold winter air swept across the restaurant. Arthur Calloway stepped inside slowly. The conversations near the entrance immediately quieted. Several customers lowered their eyes awkwardly. Others stared openly. Arthur's coat was damp from sleet, and his hands shook slightly from the cold as he removed his hat near the doorway. He looked exhausted, older somehow. Clara noticed him immediately from across the room and started moving toward him before her manager, Rick Donnelly, suddenly appeared from behind the counter. Rick had owned Miller's Diner for nearly 20 years and cared about one thing above everything else: money. And lately, business had been struggling. Rick walked straight toward Arthur with the tight smile Clara had learned to recognize whenever he was about to humiliate someone publicly. "I thought I told you already," Rick said loudly enough for nearby customers to hear. "You can't keep coming in here." Arthur lowered his eyes calmly. "I'm only here for coffee." Rick stepped closer. "No, you're here making people uncomfortable." The room became painfully quiet. Clara could feel customers watching from every direction as Arthur reached slowly into his pocket, pulling out several folded dollar bills. Rick barely glanced at them. "You're bad for business," he snapped. "Get out." For a moment, Arthur simply stood there silently holding the money in his trembling hands while people looked away pretending not to notice. Then Clara placed her tray down hard enough to make several customers jump. "He hasn't done anything wrong," she said. Rick turned toward her immediately. "Stay out of this." Clara didn't move. "He's trying to buy coffee. And customers are complaining," Rick replied sharply. "Look around." One couple near the window quickly avoided eye contact. Another customer muttered something under his breath about homeless people scaring families away. Clara felt her stomach tighten with anger. "He sits outside in freezing weather every night and never bothers anybody," she said quietly. "The least we can do is let him warm up for 5 minutes." Rick's face hardened instantly. "You want to defend him so badly?" he asked. "Then maybe you can explain why sales keep dropping every time he's around." Clara stared at him in disbelief. You're seriously blaming him for that? I'm warning you, Rick said, lowering his voice. You keep this up, you'll be looking for another job. The threat hung heavily between them, because Clara knew he meant it, and Rick knew she couldn't afford to lose this job. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then Arthur slowly placed the folded bills back into his pocket and turned toward the door. It's all right, he said softly. I don't want trouble. Clara watched him disappear back into the freezing rain while guilt settled heavily in her chest. The rest of the shift felt unbearable after that. Customers continued eating like nothing had happened while Clara replayed the humiliation over and over in her mind. Near midnight, after the diner finally emptied, Clara packed 2 containers of hot soup into a paper bag and hurried outside searching for Arthur beneath the storm. Rain hammered against the pavement. Streetlights blurred through the downpour. Then she saw him. Arthur was lying near the edge of the alley beside the dumpsters, barely conscious, soaked completely through. The paper bag slipped from Clara's hands instantly as she ran toward him. Arthur. He tried to sit up but collapsed again almost immediately. His breathing sounded weak and uneven. Clara dropped beside him in the freezing rain, shaking badly as she grabbed her phone and called 911. It's okay, she kept saying. Stay with me. Please stay with me. Arthur's eyes opened slightly. Even then, despite the pain crossing his face, he still managed the faintest smile. You stayed, he whispered. Within minutes, ambulance sirens cut through the storm. Paramedics rushed toward them while Clara refused to let go of Arthur's hand. Rainwater soaked through her uniform as they loaded him onto a stretcher, but she climbed into the ambulance beside him anyway, without even thinking about it. At Riverside Methodist Hospital, everything changed. The moment the emergency room doctor saw Arthur's face, his expression shifted completely. A nurse froze mid-step. Another immediately reached for the phone. Then suddenly security guards appeared near the entrance, while several hospital staff members started whispering urgently to each other. Clara stood there confused and drenched from the storm as 2 men in expensive suits rushed through the emergency doors carrying briefcases. One of them stopped abruptly the second he saw Arthur on the stretcher. Oh my God, the man whispered. Mr. Calloway. Clara felt her entire body go still. The name hit her instantly, not because she fully understood what was happening yet, but because everybody else clearly did. Doctors who moments earlier seemed exhausted were suddenly moving faster. Nurses straightened their posture. Security locked down sections of the hallway. Another suited man arrived speaking rapidly into his phone about shareholders, legal exposure, and notifying the board immediately. And standing there beneath harsh hospital lights, Clara slowly realized the impossible truth. The quiet old man she had been feeding behind a roadside diner for 8 months was Arthur Calloway, the billionaire owner of Calloway Industrial Systems. The man whose factories employed thousands of people across Ohio. The man whose disappearance had dominated financial news for months. And Clara had absolutely no idea why someone like him had been pretending to live like a homeless man. By sunrise the next morning, Arthur Calloway's disappearance was no longer a mystery. Every major news station across Ohio interrupted regular programming with the same breaking headline. Billionaire industrialist found alive after vanishing for nearly 11 months. Reporters gathered outside Riverside Methodist Hospital before dawn. Helicopters circled overhead. Financial analysts flooded television networks speculating about the future of Calloway Industrial Systems, while shareholders demanded immediate answers from the company's board of directors. And through all of it, one question kept surfacing again and again. Where had Arthur Calloway been? Inside the hospital, the atmosphere became increasingly tense with every passing hour. Armed security appeared outside Arthur's private floor. Attorneys moved quickly through hallways carrying confidential folders. Several members of Calloway Industrial's executive board arrived before noon, but none of them were allowed into Arthur's room. Even doctors treating him seemed nervous speaking openly around hospital staff. Meanwhile, Clara sat alone in a quiet waiting area, still wearing the same rain-soaked clothes from the night before, struggling to process what she had learned. She remembered every conversation behind the diner, every paper bag of leftovers, every quiet thank you. And suddenly, none of it made sense anymore. Late that afternoon, a television mounted near the waiting room finally answered part of the mystery. A financial reporter stood outside Calloway Industrial headquarters, speaking rapidly while images of Arthur flashed across the screen beside old photographs from company events and magazine covers. According to internal sources, Arthur Calloway had disappeared intentionally, not because of illness, not because of kidnapping, but because he no longer trusted anyone around him. The report sent shockwaves through the company almost instantly. For years, Arthur had privately battled with board members over the future of the business. Several executives wanted aggressive restructuring that would eliminate thousands of factory jobs across the Midwest. Arthur opposed it repeatedly. At the same time, tension inside his own family had become impossible to ignore. His nephew, Daniel Calloway, had spent years positioning himself as the obvious successor to the company, but Arthur reportedly refused to hand him control. Employees close to Arthur later admitted the billionaire had grown deeply disturbed by the greed surrounding him. Private recordings recovered from his office revealed arguments with executives demanding faster profits regardless of the human cost. Several family members were quietly fighting over inheritance expectations before Arthur had even retired. Then Arthur vanished, and according to leaked information from his legal team, he had spent those missing months conducting what one attorney described only as a personal evaluation of human character. That phrase confused almost everyone hearing it, except Clara, because deep down, she already knew exactly what it meant. 2 days later, Clara returned to work hoping life would somehow feel normal again. Instead, the moment she entered Miller's diner, conversation stopped around her completely. Customers stared openly. Co-workers whispered near the kitchen. Even Rick Donnelly suddenly treated her differently, forcing nervous smiles every time she walked past him. By lunchtime, reporters had already started showing up outside the diner asking questions about Arthur. Then came the lawyers. 3 men from Calloway Industries arrived shortly before closing carrying black leather folders identical to the ones Clara had seen outside her house. They asked her to sit down privately near the back office, while one of them carefully spread several documents across the table. At first, Clara assumed they simply needed information about Arthur's condition. Then she saw the photographs. Dozens of them. Surveillance images of her handing Arthur food behind the diner, walking with him in the rain, helping him into the ambulance. Even small moments she never realized anyone had witnessed. Clara looked up slowly, confused. "Why do you have these?" None of the men answered immediately. Finally, the oldest attorney adjusted his glasses and slid another document toward her. This one contained Arthur's personal signature, and beneath it, Clara's full legal name. Her stomach tightened instantly. "What is this?" The attorney chose his next words very carefully. "Miss Stark, over the last several months, Arthur Calloway made a number of confidential amendments to his estate planning documents." Clara stared at him silently. "Your name appears repeatedly throughout those revisions." For several seconds, she genuinely thought there had been some kind of mistake. But there wasn't. Arthur had not only documented her acts of kindness, he had legally connected her to decisions involving one of the largest private fortunes in the Midwest. And somewhere inside Calloway Industrial Headquarters, several powerful people had just discovered that a struggling waitress from Columbus was suddenly standing between them and billions of dollars. That was the moment Clara unknowingly became the target of people far more dangerous than she realized. Because Arthur Calloway wasn't the only person watching her anymore. And despite everything that had already happened, Arthur still wasn't finished testing her. 3 nights after the lawyers first approached Clara at Miller's diner, another black SUV arrived outside her house just after sunset. This time there were no reporters nearby, no neighbors standing outside, only silence and falling snow as one of Arthur Calloway's attorneys stepped carefully onto her porch and handed her a sealed envelope with her name written across the front. Inside was a single sentence. "Mr. Calloway would like to see you tonight." An hour later, Clara found herself sitting quietly in the back of a luxury sedan traveling through the outskirts of Columbus toward a gated property hidden behind acres of snow-covered trees. The deeper they drove into the estate, the more unreal everything began to feel. Massive iron gates opened automatically. Long stone pathways curved around frozen fountains. Warm lights glowed through towering windows ahead, while security vehicles waited silently near the entrance. Clara had spent months worrying about overdue electric bills. Now she was being escorted into one of the largest private estates in Ohio. The front doors opened before she even reached them. Inside, the mansion felt less like a home and more like a world untouched by ordinary life. Marble floors reflected the chandelier light overhead. Oil portraits lined the hallways beside dark wooden staircases polished so perfectly they almost looked untouched. Everything was quiet. Not peaceful quiet. Heavy quiet. The kind that made Clara feel like every conversation inside those walls carried consequences. Several members of Arthur's legal team stood near the dining room, speaking in low voices when she entered. Across the room, Clara recognized Daniel Calloway immediately from television interviews. Arthur's nephew looked furious the moment he saw her. Nobody introduced themselves. Nobody smiled. Then Clara heard Arthur's voice. "Let her come in." He was sitting alone near the fireplace, wrapped in a dark sweater instead of the worn coat she had become used to seeing behind the diner. For the first time, Clara could fully see the man Arthur Calloway truly was. Even weakened from his collapse, there was still something commanding about him. The posture, the calmness, the way every person in the room immediately fell silent when he spoke. Arthur motioned toward the chair beside him. "You look uncomfortable," he said softly. Clara gave a nervous laugh. "I think anyone would." For the first time in days, Arthur smiled genuinely. Then his expression slowly changed again. "You know," he said quietly, staring into the fire, "when people have enough money, they stop hearing honest things." The room remained silent. Arthur continued slowly, almost like he had spent years waiting to finally say these words aloud. "My family stopped seeing me as a person a long time ago. To them, I became contracts, shares, access. Every conversation eventually turned into money." He paused briefly. "Even people inside my company started treating kindness like weakness." Clara listened carefully while the attorneys behind her exchanged uncomfortable glances. "I built Calloway Industrial from nothing," Arthur continued. 43 years. Thousands of workers. Entire towns built around those factories. And somewhere along the way, everyone around me started believing the company existed only to make them richer." His eyes lifted toward Clara. "But then I met you." Clara lowered her gaze slightly, still struggling to understand why any of this was happening. Arthur leaned forward slowly. "You fed me when you thought I was worthless," he said. "That tells me everything I need to know." Nobody in the room moved. Even Daniel Calloway remained silent now. Arthur explained that during the months he disappeared, he had tested dozens of people quietly across several states. Some ignored him completely. Others offered temporary kindness only after cameras appeared nearby or when they believed helping him might benefit them somehow. But Clara never asked for anything, never tried to impress him, never even knew who he was. She treated me with dignity when she believed I had nothing left to offer her, Arthur said calmly. "And that matters more to me than any business degree sitting in this room." Daniel finally stepped forward. "You cannot seriously be doing this," he snapped. Arthur barely looked at him. "I already have." The entire room went still. One of the attorneys slowly opened a folder in front of him while Clara's heartbeat started rising again. Arthur had officially changed his will. Control of enormous sections of Calloway Industrial Systems had already been reassigned. Several board members would be removed immediately. Family inheritance percentages had been drastically reduced. And woven throughout those revisions was Clara Stark's name appearing again and again. Daniel's face turned pale with anger. "This is insane," he said. "She's a waitress." Arthur's response came instantly. "No," he said quietly. "She's the first honest person I've trusted in years." The room exploded into arguments almost immediately. Attorneys speaking over one another. Family members demanding explanations. Board representatives threatening legal action. But through all the chaos, Clara could barely hear anything anymore. She was still trying to process the fact that one quiet act of compassion behind a roadside diner had somehow pulled her into the center of a billionaire's empire. Then Arthur reached beside his chair and picked up one final document. Even his own attorneys looked uneasy when they saw it. And what Arthur handed Clara next stunned everyone in the room. The document Arthur placed into Clara's hands that night was not another financial agreement. It was not a settlement. And it was not charity. It was succession paperwork. At first, Clara didn't fully understand what she was looking at. The legal language blurred together as her eyes moved across the pages. But then she saw the words written clearly near the center of the document. Chief Executive Successor. Her breathing stopped for a moment. One of Arthur's attorneys immediately stood up. "Mr. Calloway," he said carefully, I strongly advise reconsidering the timing of this announcement. Arthur never looked away from Clara. The timing is exactly why I'm doing it now. Daniel Calloway stepped forward again, furious. This woman has never run a corporation in her life. Arthur's response came calmly. Neither did I when I started. The room fell silent again. Arthur explained that over the previous 6 months, while everyone believed he had disappeared, he had quietly transferred large portions of his ownership into a protected trust. Control of that trust would now pass directly to Clara Stark upon his death, along with voting authority over major company decisions. In addition, Arthur had established a charitable foundation worth hundreds of millions of dollars dedicated to helping families destroyed by medical debt, factory layoffs, and financial hardship. And Clara would oversee that too. Several executives immediately objected. One board member threatened legal action before Arthur's lead attorney interrupted him coldly. The documents are valid, he said. Every transfer has already been completed. That was the moment everyone in the room realized Arthur had planned this far longer than anyone imagined. He had not disappeared impulsively. He had spent months preparing for war against the people waiting to inherit his empire. And Clara had become the final piece of that plan. For several seconds, Clara could barely speak. I don't understand, she whispered. Why me? Arthur looked at her quietly, almost like he had already rehearsed the answer in his mind long before this night arrived. Because character matters, he said. And most people forget that once money enters the room. Then he leaned back slowly in his chair, exhausted but peaceful for the first time since Clara had met him. Most people looked at me and saw inconvenience, he said softly. You looked at me and saw a person. Clara lowered her head as tears finally filled her eyes. Not because of the money, not because her life was changing, but because after years of grief, struggle, and humiliation, someone had finally seen value in the kind of person she had fought so hard to remain. The news broke publicly the following morning. By noon, every major network in Ohio was covering the story. Headlines exploded across television screens and financial websites nationwide. Billionaire names Waitress as successor to industrial empire. Reporters flooded the streets outside Clara's neighborhood. Former co-workers from Miller's Diner stood frozen around mounted televisions replaying the announcement over and over again. Rick Donnelly watched in complete disbelief from behind the diner counter. The same waitress he had threatened to fire days earlier was now the future owner of a company worth billions. Outside Clara's home, neighbors gathered silently beneath winter skies while black SUVs lined the street once again. But this time nobody assumed Clara was in trouble. Now they stared at her house with a completely different kind of disbelief. Later that evening, Clara returned home to find Ethan waiting for her on the porch. The moment he saw her step out of the vehicle, he wrapped his arms around her tightly without saying a word. For several seconds, Clara simply held her son and cried quietly against his shoulder while camera flashes flickered in the distance beyond the gate. And miles away inside his private estate, Arthur Calloway sat alone near the same fireplace where he had changed the course of Clara's life forever. One of his attorneys asked if he was certain he had made the right decision. Arthur smiled faintly. For the first time in years, he said, I am. In a world consumed by status, power, and appearances, Arthur Calloway spent the final chapter of his life searching for something far more difficult to find than ambition or intelligence. He searched for decency, not performative kindness, not generosity for attention, but real human compassion shown when there was absolutely nothing to gain in return. And strangely enough, after traveling across towns and cities filled with people fighting for wealth and influence, he found it behind a roadside diner in Ohio, in a tired waitress who still believed struggling people deserved dignity. Maybe that was the lesson Arthur wanted everyone around him to understand before he was gone. Money reveals character, but kindness defines it. And sometimes, the people society overlooks entirely turn out to be the only ones worthy of trust. What would you have done in Clara's position? And do you think true kindness still exists in today's world? If Clara Stark had ignored Arthur Calloway that first night behind the diner, none of this would have happened. No black SUVs. No billion-dollar inheritance. No second chance at rebuilding the life she thought she had lost forever. Just another forgotten interaction between two strangers crossing paths in the cold. But sometimes the smallest decisions carry the greatest consequences. And maybe that's why this story continues to resonate with so many people across the country. Because beneath the wealth, the headlines, and the corporate power struggles, it reminds us of something most people quietly fear has disappeared from modern life. The idea that kindness still matters, that integrity still matters, that the way we treat people when nobody important is watching says more about us than success ever will. Arthur Calloway spent nearly a year pretending to be invisible, and during that time, he learned something uncomfortable about the world around him. Many people respected wealth. Very few respected humanity itself. But Clara Stark did, even when she was exhausted, even when she was grieving, even when she barely had enough to survive herself. And in the end, that mattered more than money ever could. If this story moved you, make sure to leave a like and share your thoughts below. Stories like this spark conversations people genuinely need right now, especially in a world where compassion often feels harder to find than ever before. And if you think this ending was unbelievable, wait until you hear the next story about a janitor who secretly changed a millionaire's life forever without realizing who he truly was. Subscribe now for more powerful real-life inspired stories that reveal what people are really capable of when money, status, and appearances are stripped away. Because sometimes the most extraordinary stories are hidden inside the lives of ordinary people.